This is Walter Bosley. I'll be reading Chapter 2 from Enter the Valley by Christopher O'Brien. Mother Mary made me do it. The label of a serial killer was unheard of in 1863. Few documented cases of note can be called serial killings until London, England's infamous Jack the Ripper and the 7 women he murdered in 1888. 2 books I discovered in June 1995 deserve a hearty mention: Jack Cutz's Mysteries and Miracles of Colorado and Mysteries and Miracles of New Mexico are both filled with wonderful little-known accounts from the mysterious Rocky Mountain region of Colorado and New Mexico. The following story is the saga of an unforgettable San Luis Valley trio. They are characters from anyone's worst nightmare. I was introduced to 1863 Conejos County serial killer Felipe Espinoza in Mysteries and Miracles of Colorado. The following account has few, if any, parallels in the history of the Southwest. Little known to most people, Felipe Nerio Espinoza should, I feel, be awarded the title America's most enigmatic serial killer. He was born in Veracruz, Mexico in the late 1830s to parents of average means. In 1846, when Espinoza was still a boy, the Mexican-American War commenced. In March 1847, General Winfield Scott was ordered to lead the United States Army by sea and capture the vital seaport of Veracruz. During the ensuing 3-week siege, a massive American naval bombardment rained 1,300 shells down on the city and in many instances took out whole residential neighborhoods. Prior to the furious bombardment, young Felipe Espinoza was sent away from his home by his family, probably for safety's sake. When he returned to his grandparents' home, he was horrified to discover that his entire family had been killed by a shell blast that had completely taken out their small house in the barrio. He was forced to identify the bodies of his parents, his grandparents, and his brother and sister as they lay mangled on the floor in the convent of Santo Domingo with scores of other civilian casualties. Felipe was overcome with grief, and the young, frightened boy of 12 or 13 went north to the U.S. territory of New Mexico to live with his only surviving relatives, 2 cousins, Vivian and Julian. The terror he experienced over his family's untimely death never left him. He never recovered from his grief. Almost nightly he tossed and turned in his bed, reliving in frightening dreams the horror of lifting blood-stained sheets from the broken bodies of his loved ones. Little is known concerning Felipe's teenage years, but as he grew, he evidently became more and more disillusioned with his unfortunate life. Chafing under the oppressive poverty, the cousins finally rebelled, and in 1855, led by Felipe, they struck out on their own and became successful horse thieves. Stealing horses and mules from white ranchers in northern New Mexico, they brought them north and sold them to miners in the upstart mining camps in southern Colorado. Felipe had a lifelong deep hatred for gringos, as he called the Americans that poured into the mountainous region. After 2 years or so, the Espinosas moved their base of operations to Conejos County in the San Luis Valley and began selling stolen beef to the mining camps. Espinoza was haunted by the death of his family and held the Anglo-Americans directly responsible for his torment. The local Conejos Catholic priest told of hearing from Felipe the details of a strange vision after a particularly vivid nightmare. Quoting the priest, "The Virgin Mary had come to him and commanded him to kill 100 Americans for each of his 6 slain relatives. He wished to kneel at the altar and make a vow to do so." End quote. The horrified padre had absolutely refused his request and tried in vain to convince him that he was mistaken about the apparition. He later told Conejos County Sheriff Harding how he had tried to dissuade Espinosa, quoting the priest. I tried to explain to him that it could not have been the Virgin Mary who came to him in his dreams. It was the devil tricking him, but he would not listen. Or perhaps he could not listen. If you had seen the unholy gleam in his eyes, you would understand. He went away, and I have not seen him since. End quote. In May 1863, the unprecedented carnage began. The first victim was found between Parkdale and Cotopaxi, just east of Salida, along the windy 50-mile route that follows the course of the Arkansas River down to Canyon City. A young male had been shot between the eyes and his heart removed from his chest. The second victim was found a few days later. Judge William Bruce was discovered shot between the eyes and was also missing his heart, which had evidently been removed from his chest with an axe. A cursory examination of the crime scene revealed that 3 perpetrators were involved. Posses were hastily formed and dispatched, but before the month ended, another victim, Henry Hawkins, was discovered on the banks of Fountain Creek in the same grisly condition. The next Central Colorado victims were 2 young cowboys, Nelson Shoup and Tom Brinkley. Shoup was killed instantly during the ambush about 70 miles north of the first killings. Wounded in the initial volley, Brinkley had managed to crawl away and tried to hide himself between some rocks. His luck quickly ran out. The Espinosas found him. Felipe shot him point-blank between the eyes and commenced his divinely inspired axe work. Figuring they had found an ideal ambush location on the road to Leadville, the cousins waited for their next victim. George Carter never knew what hit him as he became corpse number 5. Before the murderers could dispose of his body, a teamster named Henry Metcalf happened along and narrowly avoided a furious torrent of bullets. He was the first person to escape the Espinosa's diabolical ambushes and gave authorities their first description of the 3 marauders with their soot-blackened faces. The trio of evildoers lurked over the upper Arkansas River Valley just over Poncha Pass from the San Luis Valley, in a canyon still renowned for its beauty. The sparse population of Fremont County recoiled, and panic gripped the entire region during that 1863 summer of fear. Miners, cowboys, and travelers ventured out only in heavily armed groups, and many volunteered to be deputized as the manhunt moved into high gear. But the elusive Espinosas managed to stay one step ahead of their many pursuers. By August, more than 20 men had been bushwhacked, and their hearts had been hacked out in the same horrific manner. Area residents had no choice but to take the law into their own hands, and at least one account of a mistaken killing can be attributed to revenge-minded posses who were hell-bent on annihilating the sordid threesome. The Espinosas finally fessed up, so to speak, in a letter written by Felipe in August. Territory of Colorado Governor John Evans received the following letter, but he never knew who or what he was dealing with. The letter reads, "We have cut the hearts out of 26 American dogs so far, but we are willing to forego further slaughter if you will grant me and my followers full pardons and permit us to retain 5,000 acres we now claim in Conejos County, with the free use of all adjacent grazing lands, and that you will appoint me and any of my followers whom I designate as captains in the Colorado Volunteers. For these things we will desist from further molestation of your subjects. I will give you until the end of September to do these things, and if it is not done, 574 more gringos will die. Among them will be yourself." Signed, Felipe Nerio Espinosa. Governor Evans, quite taken aback, immediately sent a cable to Conejos County Sheriff Harding, who started an official territorial investigation into the killings. Evans announced that the Territory of Colorado was posting a dead or alive reward of $2,500 for Felipe Espinosa. The territory needed help, and there was one man who could get the job done. After the 28th victim had been discovered, an exasperated Colonel S.B. Tappan, commander of the Colorado Volunteers, dispatched Lieutenant Harold Baldwin to enlist the famous scout, Thomas Tobin. Tom Tobin, Mountain Man. I found the following biographical information in a magazine article from the 1940s. And O'Brien quotes the article here. Thomas Tate Tobin was born in 1823 at St. Louis, Missouri. His father was Irish, his mother Nova Scotian. He came west in 1837, living for some years at trading posts. He settled on the Trinquea near Fort Garland in 1858 and spent the remainder of his life there when not on the trail. Tobin gained his great reputation as a trailman by his uncanny ability to detect and follow sign. Those who had seen him trailing told me that he always took the most likely starting point, swung around and round in ever-widening circles until he cut sign, then clung to his sign until his quarry was overtaken. This technique in trailing Tobin probably learned from the Indians. Those who had seen him on the trail told me that he often went on all fours with his face close to the ground following sign. That was imperceptible to less acute eyes. He could track a grasshopper through sagebrush. Tobin was asked if he knew Kit Carson. "I ate many a beaver tail with him," Tobin said. The $2,500 reward had motivated dozens of amateur manhunters to go out and blanket the south-central Colorado mountains in an attempt to track down the Espinosas, but Tappan knew he needed a true professional to get the job done. Tobin had been a scout for the Colorado Volunteers for several years before retiring to his farm on the Trinquea, near Fort Garland. He was considered the best manhunter in Colorado. After Tobin's long conversation with Lieutenant Baldwin, they set out to track the desperados and rode to South Park to meet Colonel Tappan in Fairplay, Colorado. Tappan immediately offered the help of his whole volunteer corps, which Tobin politely declined. He asked for 6 well-provisioned, experienced soldiers and a Mexican boy to take care of his horse, who accompanied him, and Lieutenant Baldwin as they set off to hunt down the Espinosas. The men immediately headed toward the latest crime scene on the South Platte. Tobin was able to pick up the trail without much trouble. They rode upstream and began the arduous task of following the careful killer's tracks. For 3 days, the posse slowly followed the Espinosa's trail, pausing every so often when the prints became harder to locate. Finally, Tobin silently signaled for the men to stop near Levada Pass. I'll let Thomas Tobin himself finish the story. As Tobin told it, "I watched carefully and soon located their camp. I told the soldiers not to speak. I raised my hand to squat down and cock their guns, but not to fire unless I told them to do so. I took a step or two in front and saw the head of one of the assassins. At this time I stepped on a stick and broke it. He heard it crack. He looked and saw me. He jumped and grabbed his gun. Before he turned around fairly, I fired and hit him in the side. He bellowed like a bull and cried out, 'Jesus, favor me,' and cried to his companion, 'Escape, I am killed.' I gave a whoop and sung out, 'Yell, boys, I got him, so if there are any more of them, they will make their appearance.' I tipped my powder horn in my rifle, dropped a bullet from my mouth into the muzzle of my gun while I was capping it. A fellow came out of the ravine, running to an undergrowth of quaking aspen. I sung out, 'Shoot, boys!' The 3 fired and missed him. I drew my gun up and fired at the first sight and broke his back above his hips. I sent the Mexican boy off on a run to tell Baldwin what had happened. The 4 soldiers who were with Baldwin came to where I was. Espinosa had started to crawl away. He did not go very far. He braced himself up against some fallen trees with a pistol in hand, waving it over his face, using a word in Mexican that means base brutes. I had run down to where he was. I spoke to him and asked him if he knew me. I told him who I was. His reply was, 'Base brutes.' A soldier went to lay his hand on him. I said, 'Look out, he'll shoot you.' He fired but missed the soldier. I then caught him by the hair, drew his head back over a fallen tree, and cut it off. I sent the Mexican boy to cut off the head of the other fella. He cut it off and brought it to me. I put their heads in a sack and camped on the Sangre de Cristo that night. I rolled up in front of the commanding officer's quarters and called for Colonel Tappan. I rolled the assassins' heads out of the sack at Colonel Tappan's feet. I said, "Here, Colonel, I have accomplished what you wished. This head is Espinosa's, the other is his companion's. There's no mistake. We have his diary and letters and papers to show that they are the assassins." End quote. Jack Kutz asserts that the governor reneged on the $2,500 reward, claiming to Tobin that the territory had no money available to back up the reward. Other sources claim that Tobin was eventually paid $500. But noticing that Tobin was wearing an old tattered coat, Evans offered to buy him a new coat, so he'd look good for the photographers covering the conclusion of the territory's most sensational manhunt. Evidently, Felipe Espinosa's head was kept in a jar of alcohol at Fort Garland and was finally sold to a traveling carnival. Imagine growing up in the 1870s, 1880s, and seeing that sideshow face in a jar in some penny arcade, glaring out into oblivion. No one knows what finally became of the head of Felipe Nerio Espinosa. I couldn't help but wonder, after reading several riveting accounts, why I hadn't heard of the Espinosa's reign of terror before. Tabloid mass murderers have always captured the American imagination. I admit they've captured mine: Jeffrey Dahmer, Wayne Gacy, Ed Gein, David Berkowitz, and his demonic voices. These societal aberrations have periodically and unquestionably stunned and affected our culture. I went ahead and checked the record to ascertain Felipe Espinosa's impact in 19th century media in an effort to place his deviant actions into a broader cultural context. The search revealed that his story is not generally known, even in Colorado. One can't help but wonder why Felipe's cousins allowed themselves to get involved. There is no evidence to suggest they had shared their cousin's vision, so why did they embrace his pathology and embark on such an ill-conceived quest? Did they really think they could extort the territory for the lush Conejos ranchlands Felipe coveted? And what about Felipe's vision? Did he really believe the Blessed Virgin Mary had commanded him to exact such retribution on so many unsuspecting gringos? Could he have misinterpreted the message? Or more realistically, was the message delusional? In a more sinister vein, did an outside influence diabolically design the visitation to trick the psychologically fragile Espinosa into enacting his reign of terror? Even the pious local padre had a sense that Felipe was being manipulated and tried to argue with him concerning the reality of his proclaimed vision. The Conejos area where Espinosa lived contains many interesting legends and stories pertaining to the supernatural and extraordinary. In the Mysterious Valley, the first book of this series, I noted several rare legendary appearances of Old Scratch, the devil, who it is said visits north-central New Mexico and south-central Colorado, and as I've learned, other rural areas of the great southwestern United States. There is a local perception that the Conejos towns of Sanford, Antonito, and Manassas may have hosted alleged appearances of this devil at dances and or social events. It is interesting to note that I've never been able to find an actual witness to Old Scratch's urbane antics, but I've interviewed many people who claim solemnly that they knew someone who was there. Is there a connection between Felipe's vision of the Mother Mary and these local Conejos County devil legends? Let's face it, it's difficult not to leap to the conclusion that Felipe's vision was demonic in nature. What well-meaning benevolent spirit like the Virgin Mary would demand such retribution? Appearances by the historically angelic Mother of Christ have usually been just a bit more benevolent and light-hearted in nature. Children have channeled as a result of her visits. The sun has zigzagged and spiraled playfully for thousands at her arrival, and freshwater springs have joyfully emerged and bubbled forth at her behest. To my knowledge, no one has ever been instructed by Our Lady to slaughter 600 innocent gringos. This is Walter Bosley. I have just read a chapter from Christopher O'Brien's Enter the Valley.